Hey Branches, happy to see you all this morning for our online church experience. If this is your first time joining us, we want to extend a special welcome just to you. In fact, we want to hear from you. So if you're new, click the link in the comments and share some information with us so that we can send you something special in the mail just to say thanks for being here. For those of you who call Branches home, welcome back. It's good to have you with us as well. I want to remind you all that part of what makes this experience meaningful is the conversation that happens in the comment section. So don't be afraid to say hello and talk about what's going on online. Also, if Branches is your home church, I want to remind you of the opportunity to partner with us financially online. You can do that by visiting our website at branches.tv and clicking the Give tab and giving there. If you're watching on live.branches.tv right now, there is a button at the top of your screen where you can give right now. Now, if you're a fan of the old-fashioned check, that's fine too. You can send your checks to P.O. Box 676 in Scappoose. This morning, we continue our series called It's Personal, where I'm joined by special guests to discuss real-life experiences that can be applied to all of our lives. Today, we get to hear from Michael Curl, who's on staff here at Branches, about his journey to Jesus and how we can help those around us overcome the doubt that might be swirling all around them. But first, let's sing some songs and worship God together.
Good morning, Branches, and our friends joining us this morning from your homes, on your mobile devices, and wherever. We're so glad you could join us. We're going to invite you to sing along with us this morning. The words will be on the bottom of your screens. And we just pray that this will be a blessing to you as we praise our God.
Come and stand before your Maker, full of wonder, full of fear. Come behold His power and glory, yeah, with confidence draw near. For the one who holds the heavens and commands the stars above is the God who bends to bless us with an unrelenting love. And lift your hands and raise your voice. He is worthy of our praise. Rejoice. Sing the mercies of your King and the trembling joy. We are children of the promise, the beloved of the Lord, one with everlasting kindness, bought with sacrificial blood, bringing reconciliation to a world that longs to know the affections of a Father who will never let them go. Rejoice, come and lift your hands and raise your voice. He is worthy of our praise. Rejoice, sing the mercies of your King and the trembling joy. All our sickness, all our sorrow, Jesus carried up the hill. He has walked this path before us. He is walking with us still, turning tragedy to triumph, turning agony to praise. There is blessing in the battle, so take heart and stand amazed. Rejoice when you cry to Him. He hears your voice. He will wipe away your tears. Rejoice in the midst of suffering. He will help you sing. Rejoice, and lift your hands and raise your voice. He is worthy of with only a whisper, mountain shake. Jesus, our hope and strength. You make a way, unlock these chains. Here in your presence, strongholds break. Freed by the love you gave. Sing with me, we give you the highest praise. God, all the glory, all the honor. Lord, I pray as we go throughout the days, throughout the weeks, God, I just pray that you would be reminding us of who you are. God, that you are a big God. Lord, we just praise you. We just give you all the glory this morning. Lord, we just praise your name and we thank you for who you are. In Jesus' mighty name. Come on, everybody say amen.
Once I started having trouble accepting one piece of it, it became very easy to reject all of it.
Hey, good morning and welcome to Church Online and our series called It's Personal, where I get to invite a special guest to talk about their experiences in their own lives and we get to apply it to ours. This morning I have with me Michael Curl. He's on staff. You probably recognize him. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for hanging out.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you've had the opportunity a few times to speak at Branches, and one of the things that you've shared is kind of your story to faith in Jesus. And you've been able to share bits and pieces of that, but I've invited you here this morning to share a little bit more in depth of what that looked like for you, kind of your story and your journey to Christ. So I look forward to giving you that opportunity to share more of that this morning. So let's start a little bit with kind of where your relationship with the church was growing up, because I know you grew up going to church, but didn't really land there later on in your life. So tell us a little bit about your experience, I guess, growing up in the church and how that progressed as you got older.
Yeah, when I was much younger, my parents were Catholic, and so I went to a Catholic church for a long time. We used to get dragged there, and then eventually my brother and I would ask to go there, and we were dragging our parents. And I wouldn't say that it was necessarily fun, like Branches fun for kids, but more just like fun because it's a new environment. Everybody's supposed to be quiet, so that lets for a lot of trouble to happen by not being quiet. So it's just a good opportunity for something new. And then there were donuts afterwards.
Ooh, yeah.
Not during the service, but afterwards. And then the playground, which I always remember, we made this ramp on the swings that let us launch ourselves into the air. So
that sounds awesome.
Vivid memories of the church as a little child. So.
Awesome. But that was not, so you were there as a kid going to church, at one point dragging your parents there. Was it like that? How long was it like that?
Yeah, I think, so as a Catholic, eventually you go into what's called confirmation. It's sort of this track that makes you a real Catholic. I say that tongue in cheek, right? So sorry if I'm offending anybody. But confirmation, catechism, you're learning about the Catholic faith, not just Christianity, but the specifics of Catholicism. So the saints, saint celebration days, reasons and things that happened in the church in history since biblical times. So like there's a lot of church history. I still find it very fascinating. And at some point in there, you wind up as a child, you wind up going to something called Wednesday school. Not every church did it on Wednesdays, but that's what ours was.
Wednesday school was very different for me growing up.
Oh, yeah.
It was detention.
It might have felt that way for me sometimes because I was a terror to the nuns. Eventually, I became so disruptive, they asked me not to go. And I didn't want to go, honestly. Like, I didn't feel like I was learning anything. There was a cute girl in there that I would flirt with every now and then, but that was about all the interest I had.
How old were you at that point?
I was approaching like 6th grade, roughly, somewhere in the middle school years. It's hard to remember the specifics.
Sure.
But getting out of elementary school and into more formal education, I guess.
Yeah. And so you said you weren't at that point. You were really kind of no longer enjoying it. What was going on with that? Why was that? What were you experiencing?
I think there's a few themes, and it's probably more than I could even think of right now. But some of the more obvious ones would be I had what I felt were better things to do. So just distraction. Other ones would center around school. I started to teachers started to sort of impart more what I would call scientific and mathematical knowledge into their students in that time frame.
Sure.
More specifics,
Right.
a lot more of the kind of the why. When you're learning about addition and subtraction, there's not a lot to it.
Right.
But you start learning about more complicated things like square roots and logarithms and stuff, it becomes more interesting
Right.
to some people. And so I'll admit that.
Yeah.
And then the same thing with science, right? Like there's a difference between knowing that gravity is a thing versus knowing like how gravity works.
Right.
And so as I started to gain more of those contextual answers to the world around me, the church was not keeping up with that at all. And so eventually, and there's probably a long process in that, but eventually I came to the point where my questions were not being answered by the church, they were being answered by science or the academic side of my life. So I felt that there was a schism there, and I just separated them out.
So would you say, so yeah, that's really interesting. So you mentioned you weren't getting the answers to the questions you were asking at church, at Wednesday school.
Yeah.
You were getting them in school through kind of these intellectual conversations and intellectual teachings.
Yeah.
So was there a point where, or talk about the point where that you shared with me earlier, where there was kind of this moment where you're like, yeah, I don't think that not only is Wednesday school not for me, not only is the Catholic Church not for me, I'm not sure God's really for me.
Right. And I think part of it, because it was all package deal, right? So God, the church, all of that together.
Got it. Okay.
Once I started having trouble accepting one piece of it, it became very easy to reject all of it. And so as I started to have those questions that couldn't be answered by the church really had no interest in answering those at the time. The internal intellectual angst and discomfort that I was experiencing came to a head, and I just said, forget this. Like, it can't be true because all of these things contradict, or all of these things go directly against. And so it's just kind of a whole rejection of the church. I didn't fully reject metaphysical things. I eventually pursued witchcraft and Druidism and like all sorts of really kind of, honestly, kind of crazy stuff, cultish stuff. But I did reject the theistic worldview, the idea that there was one God, a creator, and that he had a personal interest in the world. I rejected that wholeheartedly.
So would you say, because it sounds like you weren't a strict materialist, but would you say that you were an atheist?
I would say for a long time I was an atheist. I eventually moved into agnosticism, I think, which is this idea of not planting a flag, but it's just instead of saying, I don't know, and being comfortable with that, or pretending to be comfortable with that. That kind of happened towards the end of high school as I moved into college. It wasn't so much that I believed in God at that point. I just was comfortable just saying, I don't need to know. And just moved into that frame of reference. It's easier to argue from that perspective because nobody can argue against my need to know something.
Right. Sure. But so what was your relationship with people of faith like at that point in your life?
Oh yeah, I was antagonistic, and that's a word that literally means I like to fight. Like I set myself against their knowledge, and that's how I thought of it. It's like they have knowledge; they don't know anything, and and that was just how I mean that stance that I just like expressed. That was literally how I acted. I was pushing people away, fighting with people verbally. I'd get in debates. I've never been a debater. I don't have formal training in that, but I would have debates with people where I definitely felt like I rocked it. Like there's no contest.
I won that debate.
and I felt like I won because they left frustrated.
Interesting.
And in the end, I made it to the point where they couldn't answer their own statements, and so I was seeding doubt in others, basically.
Right. Okay. But so now obviously something shifted at some point because you're here.
Yep.
You don't just attend a church, you work at a church, you preach, you teach the Bible.
Yeah.
You believe in God, believe in Jesus, believe in the resurrection. So
wholeheartedly.
Tell me share with us a little bit about that journey back to faith, because you're fighting intellectual questions you have, you don't want to deny logic and to embrace faith. Like there's still this
But I
wrestle.
definitely feel like I have to.
Right. You feel like in order to have faith in God, you have to deny logic or deny
Right.
intelligence. So talk a little bit about that journey back to faith. Were all your questions answered? Were all your doubts alleviated? Like just
Sure.
Yeah.
I've expressed some of the story in previous messages too, so I'll kind of summarize a little bit.
Yeah.
Basically, I spent all my time arguing with or feeling like it was in an intellectually inferior position to believe in God.
Okay.
Right? Like you said, you have to set aside your intelligence and your logical center in order to believe in something. I felt like faith was anathema to that.
A what?
Against, opposite of that, sorry.
No, you're fine.
And so I definitely resisted it just from a principle standpoint. Eventually, I ran into a guy named Stephen Hallam. I wound up rooming with him in the summer of 2002, and he would invite me to church all the time. And I love this guy. I still do. He lives in Alaska. Hi, Steve. But in the end, I would always say no. And Thursday nights was one of my free nights, so he'd always say no because I was church night. So
Right.
we never hung out, like except during the day for lunch sometimes. And I was just dying to become this guy's best friend. I mean, I just really wanted to be near him because he's awesome. I mean,
Yeah.
really. Well, eventually, I kind of ran into an intellectual crisis for myself because Time Magazine, which is not a theologically based publication, they have no interest in that whatsoever,
Right.
did a whole 12, 20-page spread on tribulation and end times and revelation and prophecy. And so that piqued my interest because here's a respected publication
Yep.
that typically
Sure.
takes a very either science or at least societally atheistic point of view, where they're not supporting a theistic worldview. They're just presenting what they feel is just the facts.
Right.
Right. At least how I saw that.
Sure.
And here they are presenting all of this mostly Christian theology and history and worldview and presenting it in a manner that I felt like in some ways was almost offensive because I was like, this can't be, you're presenting this like it's fact.
Right.
Right? Well, I mean, the reality was they were presenting biblical passages. That's a fact. I mean, they're written down, right? They've been there for thousands of years. And there's just all these little things that just kind of added up in there. And I suddenly had way more questions because I was like, this isn't stuff that I've encountered. I bought a Bible. I never opened it. So I have no idea what's in it.
Right.
Right. And so here I am with all these questions. It happens to be Thursday, and Steve-O's about to head off to church. I'm like, hey, I got some questions. Do you have a moment? He's like, sure.
And he happened to be the only Christian at the time. You hadn't run off.
Right. He's
Yeah,
the only one who
right.
because I resisted telling him he's dumb. Just in
'Cause
that,
you liked
in that
him.
part. I did. I liked
Yeah.
him. So I didn't want to say hey, I like all of you except for this part. You
Right.
know? So I didn't want to do that. So I'd been very careful with that friendship. In hindsight, it's God.
Right.
But
So you
I had
have all these questions. Yep.
And he just looks me in the eye like a deer in the headlights. He's like, Mike, I don't know. I don't know the answer to those questions. We are doing Revelation in church, though, so you want to come with me. Normally that's not that frank of an invite. He's much more gentle about it. But he was like, we might be able to answer. He didn't even promise it. It was just, we might be able to answer your questions. I was like, all right, I'll go. I mean, I've been saying no for
Wow,
months.
yeah.
I go, they don't answer my questions.
Right.
In fact, the pastor is as floored as Steve-O was about some of my questions. And looking back, if I could remember any of them, none of them were probably important. They just were what popped into my head.
They were at the
this.
time for you, though.
Yeah, I need to know this.
Yeah.
This is knowledge I need to know. Well, clearly it wasn't, because in the truck ride on the way home, I accepted Christ as my Lord and Savior
Wow.
without having my questions answered.
So I want to recap really quick because I don't want anyone to miss this. You left faith, which you may even say, I'm not even sure I had it as a kid, because of your questions, because of your intellectual confusion about faith, or a feeling that, hey, I have to deny logic and facts in order to believe. So you left the church, left faith with questions. You encounter this article from Time Magazine, which elicits even more questions.
Yeah.
And
In
then,
a new vein.
In a new vein, from a new perspective,
Yep.
right? Then you engage again with the church, and your questions aren't answered, yet you walk away saying, wow, I actually think Jesus is who he said he is. Yep. So let me ask you this then, because there's probably people watching dying to know the answer to this as well. Did you have to deny your logic and your intellect to come to the conclusion that God is real. Is it logically consistent to conclude then, from your perspective, that God is real?
Yeah, loaded question. At the time, I felt like I did.
Okay.
That I had to deny a piece of me. And I felt like I had to because what I had experienced was so real.
Okay.
I experienced Jesus, and I had all this stuff I'd been taught that just seemed to go,
They were at odds.
Yeah, I'd been spending a decade of my life saying that these were not compatible, and now I had evidence of one side that wasn't true in my head, and now in my foreknowledge, right? And so I had those two things like working against. So inside of my my mind, yeah,
Yep.
at the time.
Okay.
Now I don't, and there's a few.
Why is that? Explain what your reasoning behind that is. Like, no, I don't feel like I.
Yeah. Because logic does not deny Christ. It does not deny
Okay.
God. There's a couple of things in that. Like if you're looking for a tool, you can use time as an example. So infinite time, like if time went off into infinity in the past, then it couldn't happen now. And that's a mathematical principle because you can't add anything to an infinite to get to a location. You can start at 0 and go off into infinity, which implies that time has a beginning. Because if it was infinitely in the past, you wouldn't have a yesterday, because you'd have no tomorrow. Because there's just no place.
It's infinite. There's no place of reference.
Like, we started, so how did that happen, right?
Right.
So that's sort of that time. Time has a beginning, just from logic. That's not even an observable thing. Like, logically, it has to be true that time had a beginning. Well, observationally, cosmologically, we have observed that the leading theory, and it's widely supported, has not been disproven. We spent billions and billions of dollars trying to disprove it. It's still true. That the Big Bang is a thing, right? Like the universe had a beginning.
There was a beginning.
There was a beginning
Yep.
for time and space. Like matter and time had a beginning. Well, you can't, because we live in a causal universe, and causal just means cause and effect. It's a fancy term for just like, if you see something happen, something made it happen. That makes sense. Well, you live in a universe, right? I think anybody, atheist or not, can look around and say, yeah, I live in a place that's real. It was caused by something.
We
And if
live in an effect of some cause.
Right. And if we say that the universe had a beginning, what caused it? Well,
Right.
the only thing that can cause a cause without having its own cause is an uncaused cause, which is God. I mean, because God was not created, God creates. So logically, I see no incompatibility. And the only thing that I've had to wrestle with is undoing my understanding of what I learned. Not that I was taught things wrong, but that I understood them wrong. That I felt like they excluded things, and instead they were just additional pieces to my perspective.
Yeah, that is really, really powerful. Just being able to see, I think we all kind of struggle with that wrestle that you're talking about of what we've been taught, what we know to be true, or what we think we know to be true, what we read in books, versus what we experience. And oftentimes we see those seemingly they collide or they oppose one another. And so how do we reconcile our experiences with what we know to be true, or what we think we know to be true or have been taught?
Yeah.
And I think that's a wrestle for all of us. I think that's a wrestle for many people watching. Anybody, even the people of great faith of recent history, struggled with reconciling our experience with what we know to be true. So what would you say to people who are watching right now who might be struggling with the existence of God, might be struggling with that tension, might have questions and curiosity that they feel, man, if I don't have those answers, then I can't conclude that God is real. What would you say to someone who's in that wrestle right now?
Yeah, whether you're Christian or not, because I believe that both sides of that coin have doubts and wrestle. For me, my experience was that it wasn't the answers to my questions that I was lacking. What I lacked was a perspective, and that perspective was gained through experience. And so I only gained that experience by asking my questions, by expressing my doubt, by out loud and to somebody, stating what it was that either confused me, that I didn't agree with, that I felt was contradictory, or even that I was just wrestling with, just my own issues or whatever, that just couldn't get resolved inside of myself. Because I think so often we get stuck inside thinking that that's the entire universe of knowledge. And the moment that we kind of open up that, we see that there's a much larger area. And when you're looking, when you look through a tiny hole, your perspective is narrow. But
Right.
when you open the door, suddenly the whole world is outside.
Yeah.
And so for me, my experience with Jesus was so far outside of the perspective I expected to have that I would have never found it if I hadn't opened myself up to asking the questions that I had.
I see another side of that too, even in your story and even in what you're saying, is that not only were you able to, not only did you finally get over the fear of, or whatever it was, of asking your questions, there was also someone on the other side who was willing to say, I'm not sure, but I don't reject you because you're asking that question.
Yeah.
I mean, how big of a part do you think that played in your ability to kind of open up that door that you're talking about, open up that door of perspective?
Huge, huge. The people that you surround yourself with in your life they're going to define for you what you are comfortable in, what you feel like you can do, whether that's some sort of physical activity or whatever.
Sure.
They're gonna define the limits. And if you are following or interacting with or surrounding yourself with people who don't actively try to put limits on you, but instead are constantly trying to push you, right, to expand you, to grow you, that type of environment is going to be beneficial to you,
Yeah.
Especially if you've got doubts and questions.
Yeah.
And so, I would just pick your friends wisely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah. Well, one last question just to kind of wrap it up. How does someone get over the discomfort of not having all of their answers, all of their questions answered, yet still embrace Jesus?
Yeah, I think the reality is your faith is not at odds with your doubt, is not at odds with your intellectual capacity or lack thereof. Faith does require a step. At some point, you're going to have to make a step that you don't know where your foot will land. And that is true. But there's nothing intellectually or logically inconsistent with that reality. We all do things in our lives. All of us do things. We step onto bridges. We don't know the designer of the bridge.
Sure.
We still trust the bridge is going to hold us. We're always doing things in faith. And so if you can separate this idea that because I'm smart or because I have faith, I can't be smart, get those two away from each other. They do not belong together. One of those is totally wrong. Faith and intelligence, faith and asking questions, faith and doubt, they belong together. Mm-hmm. They are pieces of who you are. They are part of how you were made. And that's how God interacts with you. He interacts with you where you are and who you are.
Yeah, I think that's good. Thanks so much for sharing your story and for just helping us understand what to do with our doubt and our fear. And I hope for those of you who are watching who maybe have questions, have doubts, know that God is not intimidated by our questions, that God is not intimidated by the things we don't know, that He actually invites us to engage with Him. And I think for us as a church, if we can be a place where people can bring their questions, bring their doubts, and still be allowed and encouraged to participate, to engage, and to pursue a relationship with God, I think we'll see a lot of people's lives be transformed and a lot of people's minds be transformed as well. We love you. Stay tuned. Timmy's going to go ahead and ask me some more questions and even some of your own questions that you've posted in the comments. So stick around for that.
Welcome back to Talking Branches. I'm your host, Timmy Roeder. This is the great Daniel Knudsen. Is that okay?
Oh, man. You make me blush every week.
I know.
Every week.
Well, apparently your mom says I'm your sidekick. So
That's
I had
true.
To get, I
That's
had to
true.
Get you back.
Yeah.
You guys can see that at live.branches.tv. That's where
Hey, Mom.
the chatting is happening. Great talk this week with Mike.
It was fun.
I love that perspective. I love talking, some apologetics, some science.
Yep.
All good stuff. So this seems like a big issue that's gone in popular Christianity since I was a kid.
Yep.
It seemed like science and faith were always kind of at odds. Like it's one or the other. If you're a science person, if you have any sort of like inkling with science, you can't possibly be a Christian. And if you're a Christian, you can't trust something a scientist says.
Right.
Bill Nye's a bad guy, and you got to be careful with that. So,
right.
I lived a very sheltered childhood, so
Yeah.
we actually were allowed to watch Bill Nye. But
That's
there was
good.
some
That's
stuff.
good. That's good.
But yeah, so since they're always seeming like they're at odds, should they be, or how should we look at that?
Well, I mean, I think I could probably, we're a year apart, so we kind of grew up in similar situations. We actually grew up like,
block
70 yards from
Never
each other.
hung out.
Never hung out, no, except for going to rock concerts.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, I think, I mean, I had a very similar experience too, where it felt like, if you're a science geek, then you have to kind of denounce the idea of having any kind of faith in the unseen or the unknown. And on the contrary, if you're a Christian, you have to deny scientific fact almost to cling to your faith. And so for some reason, that's kind of, I think what I've seen, at least from my perspective, is that it seems like we've been required to either be fans of science or either be faithful Christians. And I think they've been set at odds with one another, probably because, and Mike kind of mentioned it, science has been used as a weapon, not as a tool. But in contrast too, faith has been used as a weapon in many ways, not as a tool. And so I think maybe some of the opposition that we've sensed is a little bit of fear on maybe both sides. Christians fearing that science is going to disprove God, which honestly is if God's real and God's true, then science, I think, will back that up
Right.
the more that we pursue truth and pursue reality. And then science being fearful that faith is going to discredit the work that they're doing. And I also think there's been a lot of inconsistent, I guess, thoughts on that too, because even those of us who are Christians, we utilize science every single stinking day. So to reject science as a whole, we don't do that. We don't live that way unless we're like extremely Amish. No electricity, no anything. And even then, I mean, a butter churn came about because some scientific experiment of how do we make butter. So, but yeah, I think we all utilize science. And I also think we all, Mike mentioned this too, we all function and live using faith to some extent every single day, no matter what we believe. So to think that they're at odds with each other is not, it's just not accurate. We're using both all the time. And so I think a lot of times when we hear about a new scientific discovery, we should go, oh, wow, that's how God did it. Rather than, denying the whole thing or rejecting the whole thing, because I don't think they need to be at odds with one another.
Right. And so did the SpaceX launch yesterday actually happen? Do we indeed have people in space?
That is a good question.
Okay. So you don't have an answer.
I don't have an answer. I wasn't there.
I'm guessing it did.
I think it probably happened.
I believe that happened.
I think that I have faith.
Yeah.
That.
So I think another thing regarding science and faith is that for a long time people were growing up maybe with a false sense of faith, where they maybe created kind of the God of the gaps, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Absolutely.
Where it's like, basically, if you can't explain something, it must be God. And then as science begins to explain things, then it begins explaining away God, because it's like, well, how did that happen before? Well, we have science for that.
Right.
And then people kind of go away from that. So in your opinion, like, how do we eliminate that God of the gaps mentality?
No, that's a good question. I think what we've seen is that we've used the unknown in the past, things we don't know, as proof for God's existence. So as science grows and science starts to learn more things and do more investigative research and come to more conclusions, those unknowns become known, which then, if that's the basis for why we believe or think that God is real, and then that gets explained away, of course people are going to go, well, then who needs God? It's literally the question. If we already know all the answers to the gaps now, but that was the proof for God's existence, then then what do we need God for?
Right.
And so how do we get away from that? We should really be looking, I think the pivotal foundation of our faith is not what we don't know, it's actually what we do know in many cases. So what we know is that a couple thousand years ago, a man named Jesus Christ walked the earth, taught things and proclaimed things about himself, about God the Creator, and about us that were brand new, right? We talk a lot about the new command that Jesus gave, which is to love one another as Christ loved us. That's what he said. That was a brand new thing. We know that Jesus was there, that Jesus walked, that Jesus lived, that Jesus taught. We also know that he died, that he was crucified. We know that that happened. And then when you look at the evidence for his resurrection, it is overwhelmingly in support of the fact that Jesus actually came back to life. And so instead of using what we don't know as the foundation of our faith, we should use what we do know and what we can conclude to be true, which includes, it must include our experiences as well. Not just historical fact and data, but our own personal experiences, which Mike hit on. And anybody who claims to know Jesus as their Lord and Savior would say, I've had an experience with God. I've had an experience as I poured my thoughts, my questions into, is God real? Who is Jesus? We've all experienced him in some level. We've experienced his truths in our life. We've experienced his presence. We've experienced all those different things. And so there's facts to back it up about what we do know. There's things we have experienced that are unique to us. So I think all of that really matters, rather than using the God of the gaps argument.
Sure. And my next question, I know some of that kind of bleeds into this next question, but Mike was talking about how we essentially have to arrive at a place where we don't have all the answers. And that's not an okay place for a lot of people to be. Like, it's not a fun place to be.
It's uncomfortable.
I like knowing everything. So
right.
How do we get to that point, and how do we live in that arena of just not having all the answers?
Yeah, I mean, we do that all the time already. I actually remember a conversation I had with somebody, gosh, it was probably a couple years ago. We were talking about, he's an atheist, agnostic, really cool guy. We always had a really good conversation, but this was probably one of the most heated conversations. And I remember he was talking to me about how irresponsible it is for me to have faith in something I can't prove, or have faith in something that I can't point to specifically. And so I launched into some apologetics, some historical facts. And he goes, have you ever seen those facts? Did you do the research? Did you figure it out yourself? Which then I said, well, no, but neither did you. You're not a scientist, but you're trusting in something you have not seen, that you have not done yourself. And recognizing we all do that. We all we're all trusting in things we don't actually know the answers to. We're trusting either somebody else, or we're taking a leap of faith and trusting something that's out there, whether it's a hypothesis or whether it's a belief system. We're taking those leaps all the time. And one of the things that comforts me so much in regards to that question is my inability to understand everything about God, our inability to understand everything about God, should not surprise us. In fact, I think it should bring some comfort to us. Because if we can fully understand everything about this complex universe, then we are God. Then we are, and if we're God, if we can fully understand God, then God isn't God. So God must be beyond our understanding, right, beyond our full comprehension, for him to actually be who he has claimed to be. So not knowing all the answers, not having all the understanding, I can rest in peace in that, knowing that God is bigger, greater, smarter, more intelligent, more compassionate, more loving, and more kind than me. But that doesn't leave me in a place of complacency where I just sit back, relax, and don't pursue anymore. So living in that tension, instead of trying to solve the problem, living in the tension of, I don't know, but I'm still going to pursue, I think is where we live our fullest life and understand more about who God's made us to be than we ever would by just sitting around.
Right. Yeah, I think if you actually could get to a point where you could fully explain everything about God, there wouldn't be people that weren't Christians, right? I mean, you would have to be. I mean, but ultimately, Christians have to live in that place where we can't explain it all, and that's where faith comes in.
Yes. Yep.
And while that's difficult, it involves us essentially putting ourselves in a humble position below and submitting to that authority and believing that, hey, God is above, his ways are higher, and I'm okay with that. I gotta be.
And I think sometimes that's the hardest part, is the humbling piece. Like
yeah.
just saying, nope, I'm okay to not know. Like you said, you're like, I want to know all the answers. I want to have all the answers. I want to have control. But if God is God, then we don't have all the answers. We're not in control. Mm-hmm. We're not the smartest person or people on the planet. Mm-hmm. So I think that can be difficult, submitting to that. So
I wrote a note here, and it's not exactly a question, but we talked a little bit about it already. The idea of being in a place where you're skeptical. I feel like there's a lot of skeptics out there, tons of skeptics, maybe more than ever. People that are just kind of agnostic, kind of just saying they're thinking or they are thinking. And for me, I'm in belief that it's okay to be skeptical for a while. You should be skeptical, but while you're being skeptical, you should be searching.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people use the excuse that, I'm skeptical right now, I'm just not really sure, but they're kind of lying to themselves and just sitting in that place where it's just like, I just don't really care. Maybe they're more apathetic and they just don't actually care to put in the time. But I feel like you owe it to yourself to put in the time.
Yes.
To get to land somewhere on the spectrum. I mean, you can't just be in the middle about it forever, I think.
Right. Well, I don't think it's fair to yourself. Like you said, you're doing yourself a disservice by being apathetic or using, well, I just don't know as a cop-out. Mm-hmm. You owe it to yourself. You owe it to even those around you, your family. If you've got kids, you owe it to your kids to pursue, to ask those questions, not to just sit there and think, well, if there's no way to fully prove it, someone else needs to prove it in order for me to believe it. That's just, you should be pursuing. And I think that's that tension we have to live in, is not having the answers, but pursuing them still. Knowing we're not going to get all the answers on this side of heaven. And we need to pursue it. I think there's probably some truth to those who maybe aren't pursuing answers. And actually, in other conversations, Mike had mentioned that this was a piece of him too, of kind of where his position was for a little while, was not being comfortable with the fact of what it means if God really does exist, like the consequences of that. So judgment, sin, we're not in control, hell, all of those realities that must be true if God truly exists. Sometimes we can avoid asking hard questions because we fear the answer. And so we either form a bias and ignore it before we ask the question, or we don't ask the question at all. And I think everything that's important requires, everything that matters, that's significant, requires us to wade into some difficult conversations. And the truth is too, the consequences of God's existence also include not just judgment, sin, and eternal, death, but also grace and mercy and compassion and love and eternal life. And so, I think some people avoid it because of that, or they avoid it because somewhere along the line, they've believed the lie that asking questions means you don't have faith or that you don't trust God. And I think that is not true, and that us as a church and as Christians should not be afraid of people's curiosity. We should encourage it, because if God's real, if we believe that God is true, then a pursuit of truth will only lead people to Him, not away from Him.
Yeah, that's good. That's powerful. And I think at the same rate, if maybe you grew up in Christianity and you, or you've just been struggling with your faith a little bit, you're getting doubt. Rather than just sitting in that doubt and letting it kind of grow, you owe it to yourself to search for truth, to ask, your leaders, research for yourself. I mean, the resources are infinite out there right now. Even if you don't like to read, I'm an audiobook guy. I mean, you can get a lot of knowledge that way, a lot of great books. And if you guys have any questions about those, we could point you in some directions for some resources for sure. We talked a little bit, I probably don't have enough time to go into this completely, but that our faith struggles have less to do with facts and more about feelings. You want to talk a little bit about that?
I think
just briefly.
Yeah, I think it goes back to something I already said, where we often fear or aren't sure of the consequences of God actually existing. It doesn't feel good to think that we are being held accountable to some moral code or moral truth, or that we're being held accountable by some entity that we can't see. I think that can be scary. It doesn't feel good, and so we avoid that, and we take the facts and skew them to fit what feels better rather than maybe what's true. So I think there's a piece of that's filtered in there.
That's good, and I know we have actually a series coming up that's going to address a lot of what we talked about today.
We do, actually. Yeah, we've got almost 2 of them back to back, actually. Our next series is called "Stop Being Such a Christian." It's gonna be fun, actually.
Ruffle some feathers.
It may, but some of those feathers need to be ruffled. So that'll be fun to kind of look at what does it actually mean to be a Christian. It's not being a Christian isn't just a label. It's actually it's a way of life. That being a disciple is actually more important than calling yourself a Christian. And then the series following that even expounds on really this topic that we're talking about right now. So look forward to that. That's going to be a lot of fun.
That's coming up this summer soon.
Yep.
I think in a couple weeks.
Yeah, in a couple weeks. Sweet. I'm trying to count. Yeah.
It doesn't matter. It's coming up soon. So be ready for that. Daniel, we're just about out of time here, but you guys are all aware at this point, our nation is going through a lot of unrest on top of the pandemic.
Right.
And it's just I don't know, man. It's like we need Jesus.
It's almost like humanity's broken.
Yeah.
And we need healing.
So if you could just pray for us.
Yeah.
Pray for the country, pray for our community and the hearts of the people.
Well, and I just want to say, I was reading this morning, probably shouldn't have been, but I was reading this morning and just reading about all the events that went on in Portland and Minneapolis and LA and just all over. And I just started crying. I was like, oh my gosh. And I was crying because, like you said, it's almost like we need Jesus. It's almost like the church needs to proclaim the truth of Jesus more than ever right now. And I think what's so crucial is for us as Christians, as disciples, to recognize our number one priority is to get people to Jesus. That's it. Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and God the Father, they're the ones who change hearts and change minds. We just need to proclaim it. And so I will pray. I want to pray for peace. I want to pray for boldness for us as Jesus followers to proclaim His truth and His love. So God, thank you so much for your grace, God, for your mercy. God, that you accept every single one of us, no matter where we come from, no matter what our background is, no matter what our current situation is, no matter what our current struggle is, God, you accept us right where we are, that you have extended forgiveness for our past, present, and future sin. And God, I'm grateful that you also love us too much to leave us right where we are. God, that when we enter into a relationship with you, we're changed, we're transformed. We're transformed in our minds, we're transformed in our hearts, we're even healed in our bodies oftentimes, God. And I just pray for our nation. I pray for those who are broken and hurting, those who are upset, those who are frustrated. God, that the world, that our nation, that our state, that our city, that our county would recognize that the answer and the solution to all of our inner longings is you and you alone. God, that nothing else can solve the brokenness of our humanity, the brokenness of our human state, the brokenness of our hearts, the sin that so easily entangles us and honestly is continuing to consume our world. God, you are the solution to it. And so, God, I pray that you would help those of us who have the answer, which is you, that you would give us courage and boldness to love people the way that you loved us, God, to be full of grace and to be full of truth, that both would be evident in the way that we speak and the way that we live at every moment, God. We understand, we believe, and we trust that you are in control and that you are at work right now through us and in us. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Daniel.
Yep.
All right, guys, we will see you next week for Talking Branches. Have a great week.